hoplite morality.
When the Spartans marched on Attica the following summer, Pericles' strategy was clearly under fire. Yet no one could possibly have foreseen what would happen next.
Athens was hit by a terrible plague, which wiped out something like a third of the population in Athens. Think about what that would mean. Translate that into American terms. I mean, you're talking about what, 90 million people?
The deadly disease, probably brought aboard a grain ship from Egypt, turned the streets of Athens into corridors of horror. The city was littered with dying men. Young and old, rich and poor fell victim. The plague played no favorites.
The effect of the plague was to cast Athens, and consequently its army and navy, into a state of disarray.
And suddenly, the Athenian game plan doesn't look great. It also kills Athens' leader, Pericles, and suddenly the man with the plan is no longer around to pursue it.
The death of Pericles left Athens prey to hostile factions and reckless leaders. But what also died was even more profound: his extraordinary vision.
And that caused extreme problems for the Athenians because there was no obvious succession to him. He hadn't planned one, and it was a democratic city. There was no government. And the individuals who each thought they ought to be the successor had rather different views, and they lacked the authority of Pericles. So Athens was in a difficult position.
In addition to the devastating losses, the plague also inflicted enormous psychological damage on the Athenians. Their faith in the gods was rattled, their self-confidence severely shaken.
And in the aftermath of this, they sue for peace. The Spartans think they're going to win, and they turn down the peace offer, and the war goes on.
The Athenians all of a sudden have become wimps, is the way it would have looked to the Spartans. They won't come out and fight us. They've never done that before. And therefore, it's terrible for us to make peace, I think the Spartans must have said, with people who don't even have the guts to come out and fight.
It broke their back for the moment, but the Athenians are kind of like the Americans. They're tremendously resilient people.
And so, Athens assembled 250 triremes, making it the largest naval deployment of the war. Following a revolt on the island of Lesbos, they made use of this force and blocked the harbors of Mytilene. The next year, 427 BC, Athenian general Nicias led Athens to victory at Minoa. The Spartans countered with a decisive win at Plataea. And so went the Peloponnesian War, from city to port to island, all over the Aegean. Strike and counterstrike, revolt and forced submission.
And so both Athens and Sparta, in the first few years of the war, are really in pretty desperate straits. Neither of them really has a way to win this thing.
Despite their resolve, the Athenians especially felt the chilling effects of war. Their population was devastated, their land ravaged, and their treasury nearly exhausted. Still, as the campaign season of 425 approached, Athens valiantly prepared for battle. That summer at Pylos, on the western shores of Greece, the Athenians forced the unprecedented surrender of 120 Spartan equals. Shattered forever was the carefully cultivated myth that neither force nor famine could make the Spartans give up their arms.
The Spartans were so upset at this loss of Spartan manpower, and also, by the way, nobody could believe that Spartans ever surrendered. It was inconceivable. It never happened before, so that they just wanted to wipe this whole thing out, but they also didn't want these men to be killed. It was these hostages that finally compelled the Spartans to make peace.
But on what terms? After 6 grueling years of fighting, no useful result could be claimed by either side. Sparta was unable to liberate Greece from the grip of the Athenian Empire, while Athens had failed in its quest for absolute security, the very reason Pericles risked war in the first place. The expenditure of lives, suffering, and money, it seemed, was all in vain. Eventually, an uneasy peace would be brokered, then shattered, thanks to one of history's most colorful and unpredictable characters. The humiliating surrender of the Spartans at Pylos in 425 BC completely altered the course of the Peloponnesian War. Sparta, with 120 hoplites imprisoned in Athens, had no choice but to seek peace, under terms extremely favorable to Athens. For the Athenians, this was one victory to be savored.
Spartans would never have come to this, no matter what happened to them, if something like that hadn't taken place.
All Greece resounded from the shock. Spartan soldiers had laid down their weapons and surrendered.
Sparta and Athens once again came to the table, but this time the political climate favored peace.
Both sides had very powerful reasons for wanting to make peace. The Athenians had lost Amphipolis in the north, a major city, and with access to timber, trade routes, and generally that whole part of the empire was therefore slightly destabilized. The Spartans had lost a significant number of individuals, captured in 425, held prisoner as hostage in Athens.
However, peace was elusive, and hostilities began to breed again. As the two sides drifted back towards war, Sparta threatened to fortify a post in Attica. With 120 Spartan soldiers still in captivity, it was risky. But the dangerous bluff worked, and Athens agreed to terms. The articles of the treaty, called the Peace of Nicias, were meant to be binding for 50 years. The fighting stopped, and the disgraced Spartan prisoners were finally set free.
Theoretically, both sides laid down their arms, but it was kind of like a peace between Russia and the United States. It was a Cold War.
Immediately there were problems. Several of Sparta's allies refused to accept the peace treaty, including Boeotia, Megara, and Corinth.
Peace of Nicias had to be consolidated by a separate agreement between Athens and Sparta, and that was in a way its undoing, because the other allies of Sparta and some of the allies of Athens thought, what are Sparta and Athens up to? What do they know that we don't? And there were particular outstanding grievances on both sides.
Meanwhile, in Athens, a leader emerged, a man who loved to mock authority and rile the conservatives. A man who would prove to be one of the most flamboyant characters in history. His name, Alcibiades.
Something of a tremendously ambitious guy, something like a JFK plus General Patton, sort of a forerunner of Alexander the Great, in that he came from an extremely wealthy family, had tremendous ambition, great war hero, student of Socrates, etc., etc.
His father died when he was young, and he was a ward of Pericles, raised by Pericles in the great man's house. And I think that's a critical thing. You don't have to be Dr. Freud to see the influence here. For the rest of his life, he tried to be greater than Pericles, because that's the kind of personality that he had, which was mighty tough.
He is loved by men, he is loved by women. He's clearly the most charming and most exciting man of his time, and he's a chameleon.
Alcibiades was also unscrupulous and fabulously persuasive. He quickly forged alliances with some key Peloponnesian city-states, including Elis, Mantinea, and Argos. Predictably, this forced a confrontation with Sparta, and the uneasy peace of Nicias began to unravel.
Meanwhile, the Argives are putting together an independent league of democracies in the Peloponnesus who want to fight Sparta, and Athens joins them, and there's this enormously important day in the history of the Greek world, in the history of democracy, that nobody knows about. It is the day of the Battle of Mantinea, which takes place in the year 418.
Located right in Sparta's backyard, Mantinea was a battle that had to be won. But the Spartans quickly found themselves outflanked by the enemy. Facing certain defeat, the Spartans broke from their patented phalanx, defying their commanding king's orders. It was a gutsy move that ran counter to everything they had been taught since childhood.
Sparta was very lucky that day, because the officers who were told, you move from here to there, said, hell we will. They refused, and later on were punished for it. And that allowed the Spartans to take the battle. If they had lost, I do believe that would have been the end of Sparta as the state we're talking about.
Argos immediately renounced its alliance with Athens and joined the Spartans. Remarkably, Alcibiades came out relatively unscathed, and over the next 2 years he cooked up a convoluted scheme. It was here at this podium where he laid out his plan to the assembly.
Alcibiades' plan is lunatic. He wants to eventually empty the city of Athens, get a fleet. The final tally will be 200 ships, 40,000 men will sail 800 miles away and ostensibly attack a democracy that's bigger than themselves and is an ally of Sparta.
The target was Syracuse, located on the island of Sicily, an area of rich arable farmland and vast mineral resources. Nicias was adamantly opposed to the plan, but he was no match for the charming Alcibiades.
I compared Alcibiades with Bill Clinton, and I compared Nicias with Bob Dole. That is to say, a man too cautious and too conservative, a Spartan at Athens, whereas Alcibiades was the most Athenian of the Athenians, the most bold of the bold. And he took enormous pleasure in his capacity to outwit people.
Nicias argued that it was imprudent to attack Sicily with so many troubles at home. But when the votes favored Alcibiades, Nicias was forced into a risky gamble.
He says, look, Sicily's big and strong. We need a fantastic force if we're going to do it. And so his hope is that the Athenians will be scared off at the high cost of this and they'll stop. Well, instead, some wise guy, politician, pops up and he says, yeah, like what?
Nicias quickly realized his ploy had backfired, but it was too late. Athens, fueled by the fiery rhetoric of Alcibiades, was consumed by a lust for war.
And they finally pass everything that he asked for. And they turn it into a monstrous expedition, which the negative bottom line is, if you lose that, you're probably finished.
Alcibiades, however, saw it as a call to brilliance. He was thinking honor and glory, not defeat. But in a city rife with envy, his every move was suspect.
Just before the Grand Fleet is supposed to go off, a really nasty business happens. Various statues of the god Hermes are defaced all of a sudden all over the city all at once.
So the bottom line was a kind of a McCarthyism, a siege of McCarthyism happened in Athens, where people were arrested by the hundreds. Innocent people were turning stool pigeon, turning in their friends. They did it, he did it.
Enemies of Alcibiades spread rumors that he was to blame. So Alcibiades faced the serious charge of sacrilege. Outraged, he demanded a trial without delay while his popularity was at a peak. However, his accusers conspired to postpone the arraignment. They would try Alcibiades in absentia, after the Armada set sail for Sicily. It would prove to be a decision with catastrophic consequences. In 415 BC, the Athenians prepared to launch an awesome armada of warships for the 800-mile voyage from Athens to Sicily. Under the dual command of Alcibiades and Nicias, the most costly force ever assembled was eager to conquer a land of abundant riches and eager to bring Sparta to its knees. But Alcibiades was operating under a veil of suspicion, accused of committing unspeakable acts against the god Hermes.
And so off sails a great fleet. But shortly thereafter, the Commission of Inquiry into Alcibiades and his nefarious activities turns up a guilty verdict, and an envoy is sent to recall Alcibiades to come back to Athens to face punishment.
The result of that recall is that Alcibiades has no intention of going back and placing his life in the hands of the Athenian assembly, which he knows is equal to a death sentence.
A victim of his own glory, Alcibiades chose to escape rather than face the judgment that awaited him. But only a man with the swagger of Alcibiades would dare try his next move.
He goes to Sparta. And now we have Alcibiades in Sparta. They accept him, of course, because he's a renegade Athenian. who knows a lot and could be helpful to them.
And that was when everything kind of really got crazy, because Alcibiades, who had been in Athens, the supreme Athenian, dressing well, wearing his hair long, having wild symposiums, parties, things like this, now in Sparta immediately became more Spartan than the Spartans. He wore the simple plain cloak, he exercised, he trained at the gym, and everyone fell in love with him.
Alcibiades brought a sense of vision and audacity to the reserved Spartans. Meanwhile, at Syracuse, Nicias was in charge of an expedition he never wanted to launch in the first place.
And poor Nicias, besides not wanting to fight in Sicily and being a very conservative, cautious leader, superstitious, is also suffering from kidney stones. So he's in poor health.
Despite lackluster leadership, the vast Athenian navy simply overpowered the Sicilians. On the ground, Athenian wall builders tried to systematically cut off enemy supply lines. Syracuse, once a pleasing mix of temples and promenades, was soon in ruins, her troops a study in disorder and insubordination. With the city about to fall, Syracusan envoys were dispatched to Sparta to persuade them to help. Alcibiades convinced the reluctant Spartans they had to act at once. The Athenians, he revealed, would not rest until they ruled the West, including the Peloponnesus.
The Spartans sent one man, a man named Gylippus, to put steel into the hearts of the Syracusans.
Unlike most Spartan generals, known for their cautious and conservative demeanor, Gylippus served with uncommon bravado. Gylippus set sail with only 4 ships and a small contingent of Marines, but they were a welcome sight to the outmanned Sicilians.
And so the Syracusans both get a genuine military expert, someone who really knows how to get things done, and they also get somebody that they really trust.
Immediately after Gylippus arrived in Syracuse, a counterwall was constructed to intersect the Athenian lines. Then, over the next 12 months, Gylippus refashioned the army and navy to reflect Spartan discipline and order.
And he just whipped the Sicilians into shape, just turned them into crack troops, little by little by little, instituted certain things. He instituted the common messes, and Sicilians and Spartans were Dorians. They were ethnically related, so they had certain common societal structures, and he exploited these things, and he turned them over a period of a year into crack troops, and they defeated the Athenians in an incredible battle in the great harbor of Syracuse, where the Syracusans had a wall of ships across the mouth of the harbor.
At day's end, most of the Athenian fleet was destroyed by the Spartan-led Sicilians. Casualties were massive, the sea becoming a carpet of dead and dying bodies. Faced with certain death, the surviving Athenians fled, but soon became bogged down in swampy terrain, where they were slaughtered almost to the man.
The whole debacle will end in the Asinarius River, where the Athenians are drinking mud and blood and fighting each other to have it.
They're just cut to shreds by the Syracusan cavalry and the Syracusan land forces, infantry forces. It is a catastrophe the likes of which the Athenians have never suffered, never even imagined suffering.
In the wake of the humiliating defeat, Nicias surrendered. He was eventually executed. The 2-year siege of Sicily had indeed been a disaster.
This was different. It was not like being defeated by the Spartans on Greek territory, but rather it was being defeated away from home in a way that was visible to the entire Hellenic world, both in Greece and abroad in the many influential colonies.
However, things were very different in Sparta. Gylippus returned home to a hero's welcome, while Alcibiades tightened the noose on his former city-state. He advised Spartan commanders to establish a permanent encampment at Decelea, within sight of the walls of Athens. In 413 BC, a garrison was installed, enabling Spartan troops to conduct their scorched earth policy year-round. Athens was forced to rely mostly on imported food, but with a much reduced navy to keep its port open and free.
Everybody in the Greek world thought it was over. And there's a general uprising in the Athenian Empire as many, many states rebel.
Alcibiades, ever the opportunist, moved in for the kill. First, he encouraged the Persian governor, Tissaphernes, to fund Sparta's war effort. Then Alcibiades snatched several territories from under the control of Athens. But all the while, he was up to his old tricks, consorting with none other than the Spartan king's wife, Timea.
Alcibiades is a man who could simply never let well enough alone. He engaged in intrigues in Sparta, which won him some real enemies. Those enemies sent word to the king of Sparta, in command at the garrison at Decelea, that the king's wife was due to have a baby.
When King Agis counted up the months since he'd last seen his wife, the numbers just didn't work.
The enemies of Alcibiades immediately point the finger and say, and you know who the real father is.
I would imagine King Agis wasn't too happy about this, and Alcibiades had to kind of hot-foot it out of there, one jump ahead of the hangman.
And so now, having turned his coat